How is everybody today? Good. This is week 3 out of 4. The Russian Revolution. Today I'm going to go into, well, I'm going to spend some time on the Civil War, I guess, and the events surrounding that. I'm going to go back to, in fact, today has been a Russia Day. I was to my wife about that this morning. She says, what are you doing today? I says, well, I got to do my Russia history class over the Latham Center in New Canaan. This morning was Mr. Putin. And yeah, that's an interesting character. I said, then I got to go to the Darien Library and do post-revolution, the Civil War. And I said, then I'm going to the City Hall today, to Norwalk City Hall, and listen to the mayoral debate. She says, that's not Russia. I says, well. 3 out of 3. Anyway, going back to the, again, just to backtrack here just a little bit. I'm not going to go all the way back to the beginning of the Russian Revolution, but going back to the late summer going into the fall of 1917, when it was apparent here that the provisional government, Kerensky, was going the way of the dodo. And at this point, Lenin has been preaching, you know, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and we have to undermine or get rid of that provisional government. And he's been urging his followers to jump on board here, that we need to take advantage of this because the peasants are already they're already taking the land. They weren't going to wait for the provisional government. They weren't going to wait for the Petrograd Soviet. It seemed like they were dragging their feet. They are out in the countryside and they are grabbing the land. You know, at some point burning down the mansions or palaces of the landed gentry, and in some cases killing the landed gentry, grabbing the land, parceling it out. They're not waiting. You know, and it's kind of hard to tell 90% of the population who are peasants, stop it. Kind of hard to do that. And Mr. Lenin understood that his is supposed to be a workers' revolution, Marxist. And again, he takes what was Marx, but adds the peasantry to it. That the worker needs to get together with the peasantry to take power. And that's why he's saying here, you better grab onto the peasantry now, or else what's going to happen to us in case the provisional government can make a deal with the peasants? What's going to happen to us then? And he's also thinking the Social Revolutionaries, which is that party that is part of the Petrograd Soviet, which is peasant only. They're 100% peasant-supported party, and so they can't be caught in this squeeze here. And so Lenin again goes back to the French Revolution here when he understood that, you know, when the nobility is taken out, you've got the middle class or the bourgeoisie, which is pump priming the peasants to take control of the countryside. And as the peasants are taking the land for the nobility, they're going to use the peasantry to discipline the workers in the cities. And Lenin does not want that to happen to him. Does not want that to happen to him. And so it will work for them. They will get people on board and they will take power October going into November 1917. But however, in December, when they have the so-called parliamentary elections, what happens? The Bolsheviks get 38% of the seats. 30% of the seats. The Social Revolutionaries got 58% of the seats. They control the majority of the peasants here. And so they control the majority of the seats. And so this idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't look like it's going to work out too well. And so when the parliament goes to take their seats in January, what does Lenin do? Shows up with the Red Army troops, and they arrest all the delegates, and he proclaims a dictatorship of the proletariat. So much for parliamentary procedure. It's over with. It's over with. However, Lenin does have a problem here. You know, in the fall, summer and fall of 1917, what is he saying? What are the Bolsheviks saying? All power to the Soviets. You know, all power to the workers. Well, all power to the workers. Some of these workers are doing things not much different than the than the peasants who are taking the land. They're taking control of their factories. And almost along the lines like a worker co-op now. Let's throw out the Tsarist overseers and we'll take control of the factories. Well, if Lenin wants to nationalize everything, how's that going to work? That's a problem. That's a problem. He wants to nationalize the industries. He wants to nationalize the banks. He eventually wants to nationalize the land. But when 90% of the peasants, 90% of the population are peasants and they're grabbing the land, again, it's kind of hard to say no. Kind of hard to say no. Then there's another issue here. The Germans. You know, the Russian army melted like a snowball in August in the summer of 1917. And also after that ill-fated offensive that the Tsar put together for the summer of 1916 to take the pressure off the British and French armies stuck in the Somme River battle and Verdun. And I mentioned earlier, in that summer of 1916, General Alexei Brusilov was able to inflict 600,000 casualties on the Austro-Hungarian army. That was like 20% of the total amount that Austria-Hungary will mobilize for the war. And again, this harkens back to what Lenin said before the war. In today's world, meaning prior to 1914, we now have commercialized, industrialized wars, and you not only conscript the entire economies for war, the entire populations for war, and these wars are going to last a long time. The last years. What's happened here? That's what's happened. And so man has mobilized the entire population, but his entire economy to wage modern industrialized war. That's what you saw here, especially the 39 to 45 conflict. And you can see what happens to the death toll. What, 4 years in what you call World War I, 15 million dead. The second chapter of this, upwards of 60 million dead. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. Round numbers, 75 million dead in 10 years of war. If you want to break it down into years here, it's a lot of people. And so Lenin is telling his people that he's telling everybody in Europe, don't listen to your leaders, don't listen to your military commanders, just don't show up, really. That's what he's saying. Don't fight. The war's not for you, it's for capitalist advantage. Money, power, colonies. Why should you die on something like that? It doesn't benefit you. That's basically what he's saying here. And so by 1916, it is really a decisive year. The Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme River. And so to take the pressure off the West, the Russians will launch a summer offensive. But it's going to cost them 1 million men. And again, this is where the Russian army begins to melt. These guys are walking home. Same sort of thing happens in the summer of 1917 when Kerensky wants to keep Russia in the war. Why? To maintain that amount of money and credits and supplies from Britain, America, and France. And so what's going to happen here? The Russian army is going to melt again. And that's going to be the end of the provisional government by all intents and purposes. Lenin is proven right to a certain extent here. But again, that leads to a problem here. All power to the Soviets, all power to the workers. Well, he wants to have a dictatorship of the proletariat. How's this going to work? It's a problem. They do begin to nationalize some of these industries. They begin to nationalize the banks after January 1918. But again, as they're doing this, there's a problem with the Germans. The Germans are still in Western Russia. And Germany has a problem here. And Germany's problem is the British blockade. It was biting and biting hard. The British fleet had defeated the German Navy during the Battle of Jutland, May 1916. So the Germans could not break the blockade. And so the British Navy has sectioned off the North Sea and the English Channel, and German ships can't get out. The only ships that can really get out are blockade runners, occasional raiders, and the U-boats. And that's how the Germans are going to reply here, but that's going to bring America into the war. Keep in mind, unrestricted submarine warfare was not acceptable. Or as the New York Times used to call these U-boat captains, they're pirates, they're murderers, they're brigands, so on and so forth, yet they're not going to say that about American submariners in World War II. It's more acceptable then. Well, things do become acceptable. Again, this is modern commercialized war. And so the Germans want Ukraine, the breadbasket. That's what they want. And as one German negotiator is going to say, because Lenin's going to ask Trotsky to be the negotiator, but Trotsky is as brilliant as he is, he doesn't have a whip hand here. The Germans do. And one German negotiator says it's only a matter of what kind of sauce the Russians are going to pick to be eaten with. And so Russia, for a temporary period, will lose Ukraine. They're going to lose Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. They're going to lose Finland, and they're going to lose their control of Poland. Was part of the Tsarist Russian Empire. They're going to lose that. They lose a lot of territory here. That's a lot of people, a lot of resources. They're going to have to swallow this. At the same time, though, Lenin understands the gravity of this, so we're going to move the Russian capital from Petrograd to Moscow. One of the smartest things he ever did. Because now it gives him more of a centralized control. He has the middle, if you want to call it, of the country. And so does that make him popular in certain quarters to having given away that territory? No, but there was nothing he could do about it. But it's only for a short time, because what's going to happen Armistice Day 1918, the Germans surrender. So turning the Ukraine into a German delicatessen, in the end, really didn't work out too well. Which is what Hitler's going to want in 42. Interesting what you see develop here. But there is a problem here for Lenin. You know, now you're going to have opposing forces spring up here. The White Russians. General Yudenich, Admiral Kolchak out in Siberia with another enemy army to the Bolsheviks. He wants to set up his own state in Siberia. And on top of that, British, French, and some American troops land at Archangel, Murmansk. Japanese land in Siberia. You know, they were hoping to carve out some territory too. They landed like 90,000 troops. And yet Wilson's going to send about 10,000 Americans out to Siberia as a warning to the Japanese, don't take any undue liberties here. So you can see the beginning. Actually, this is just another episode in that Japanese-American friction that's building up here in the Pacific. Building up here in the Pacific? Yes, you see that coming. And so there are going to be fights between British, French, and American troops against the Reds. And then the Reds have to fight the White armies. But again, the White armies are split. Why? Because the Bolsheviks are in the middle. They have control of Moscow. It's easier for them, it's easier for the Bolsheviks to extend outwards from Moscow. The peasants, what's their plight? Keep in mind, these White Russian armies, they're not for the peasant at all, and yet they're going to conscript peasants to fight. Keep in mind, there's actually another group that springs up here. The Greens. Nobody talks about the Greens. Oh, who the heck are the Greens? These are people, that's a color accorded, these people who are peasants and Cossacks who don't want to be applied to the Whites or the Reds. They don't like either of them. So now you got that faction. And so it's a free-for-all here. What you're seeing in Russia is a free-for-all. Keep in mind, this is getting into the later part of 1918, and since the war is over with, what else is happening? The Middle East. There's no more Ottoman Empire. The British and French are carving borders. There's going to be fighting here now. Is the war really over? No, it's morphed into something else, essentially. And so by 1919, you'll see the Syrian, what's going to be known as Syrians, rising up against the French. 1920, you're going to see the Iraqis, this newly minted Iraq. Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds drop their differences and want to throw the British out. And the British, French, Greeks, and Italians want to carve up Anatolia. There wasn't supposed to be a Turkey. And then put together a couple of rump states like Armenia and Kurdistan. That's not going to last. Kemal Ataturk is going to lead the war, the Turkish War for Independence, 1919, 1922. And he'll throw out the Greeks, the Italians, the French, and the British, and there'll be no Armenia, and there'll be no Kurdistan. And then make a deal with Lenin. Hey, look, you know, the Armenians in the Caucasus and the Armenians in Anatolia, why don't we just put pay to them and be done with it? Lenin says yes, and that's what's going to happen. There'll be no Armenia. Because at one point there was supposed to be an Armenian Republic that Armenians in the Caucasus added to Armenians in Anatolia. That would have been a decent-sized Armenian Republic. Well, it's wiped off the map by the Bolsheviks and the Turks. One of Woodrow Wilson's favorite oppressed peoples, the Armenians, just like the Poles. What was it? The pianist Paderewski was touring the United States, playing all these concerts, really, to push the plight of Poland. That'll work for 20 years, because then the Nazis and Stalin are going to what? Wipe it off the map. It's gone again. Here today, gone tomorrow. And so Mr. Lenin still has a problem here. You know, the peasants definitely do not want to go with the white armies. Why? Because what do they represent? The monarchists, the army, the businessmen, the banker, the landed gentry here. They're not going to leave the land of the peasant. They're going to want to take it back. At least with the Bolsheviks, at least the peasant sees we've got a shot with Lenin. I mean, we've already taken control of a lot of the land. So we'll fight with the Bolsheviks. Keep in mind, though, what's going on here, because the Russian economy is going where? What happened to Russian money? It's almost as bad as Confederate money. Not much to it. And so at the same time here, what's developing? Barter system. You know, the Lenin's going to send, or the Cheka. I like what they call the Cheka here. I mean, it's interesting what they call the Cheka. Lenin's secret police. Interesting name here. I like the names they give some of these organizations. The names themselves are really almost to the point they're comical. Here it is. This is Felix Dzerzhinsky's Cheka. The All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Struggle Against Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation. Yeah. All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Struggle Against Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation. It's a secret police. It's along the lines of the Gestapo. Or the Savak in Iran. Remember when the Shah had the Savak? Yeah, secret police. But that's what the Cheka was. That's what the Cheka was. What was that thing in James Bond? Remember Spectre? Yeah. The special, what was it? The Special Executive Counterterrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. Ernst Stavros Blofeld. Leave it to Fleming. Boy, what a name that was. It's the same sort of thing. I'm wondering that's where Fleming got it from. Yeah. Yeah, I'm wondering if that's where Ian Fleming got it from. Interesting. We'll talk about author's license. But what is Dzerzhinsky doing? He's cracking down on so-called counter-revolutionaries. Or as that term popped up again during the Vietnam War, when after Hue, Marines found 3,200 dead people executed by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese before they left Hue. You know, they get kicked out. Police functionaries, other South Vietnamese government functionaries, they were considered counter-revolutionaries, or one of the favorite communist lines, rightist deviationists. I like the terminology here. It's fascinating, the terminology here. And so many of these people, these peasants, are going to go with the Reds. Now both sides, Reds and Whites, have to build armies. You can't take the field without an army. What good is that going to be? What good is that going to do? But this is where, you know, this idea of Bolshevik organization really rises to the fore. They're not very good at organizing a government. I mean, a barter system. There were actually some Bolsheviks who were thinking, gee whiz, we're into barter and the economy's going, and the money's going into the tank. Boy, this is the end of capitalism. The workers' paradise. It's the end of capitalism. Well, now you're going broke. But barter works. And so when Lenin, you know, when they would, the Cheka would send out the collection squads to the farms, I mean, the army has to eat. So they're sending out the collection squads to take a certain percentage of the grain and the livestock to feed the army. Some of these collection squads go there with effects to barter. Or they're just going to take the grain. And if they just take the grain, is that going to sour some of the peasants on the Reds? Yeah, it will. And so Lenin, to a certain extent, isn't doing anything much different. Well, Stalin's going to do this later on, but only on steroids. But it's almost like what you saw during the American War, the Civil War, a war between the states. Or for some of you here who have parentage going back below the Mason-Dixon line, you know, that war of northern aggression? I like to call it the revolt of the planters, because to me that's what it was. But at the same time here, you know, Richmond would send out the collection squads. I mean, they have an army of 875,000 men at one point in the South. It's got to be fed. And so if your currency, again, like in revolutionary Russia here, if your currency is lousy, as it was in the South, how much is it going to buy? What do? You send out the collection squads and you take a certain percentage of the small farmer's grain and his livestock so you can feed the army. So it's the same sort of thing happening all over again. Happens here. Happens here. And so, but most of a good percentage of the peasantry will stick with the Reds because they know what's going to happen if the whites win. Poland, this newly minted Poland. You know, that thing that during the negotiations here with John Maynard Keynes, the noted economist who advised Lloyd George Poland's an economic impossibility whose sole major export will be Jew baiting. You know, that's realpolitik. That's realpolitik. Isn't there a school of economics named after this guy?
Yeah, Keynesian.
Keynesian economics, right? Yeah. Shows you what's going on here in the hallowed halls of upper crust, you know, diplomacy here. And so the Poles, you know, we're having a newly minted Poland here. Okay, let's see what territory we can grab in the east. Again, we're going to the east, this avenue of invasion, which when I went this morning with my Russia history class, Mr. Putin understands only too well. That's why they won't let Ukraine become part of NATO. Again, we're back to Ukraine. You see what happens here? It's the same thing over and over again. Maybe the premise is a little different, but what is history doing here? That's what it's doing. And so you see the Poles. Now you have the White Russians. You've had the foreign troops here, British, American, French, Japanese, and now the Poles. Let's grab territory. And where are they going through? The old avenue, Ukraine. Now that makes Ukrainians angry because it's at one point, you know, when it was Czarist Russia, you know, there were still, you know, this was part of the Polish Empire at one point, and the Russians are going to kick them out. But some of the old Polish landed gentry still existed, and they're what? Catholic. And they're overseeing Ukrainians. And answer to who? St. Petersburg. And so if the Russians are what? Eastern Orthodox? Many of the Ukrainians were what? Eastern Orthodox? And yet, Tsardom is catering to Roman Catholics to oversee Eastern Orthodox. Yeah, that makes these people real happy. Yes?
Russia is a huge landmass.
Oh, yeah.
So therefore, when you're really talking about Russia, during World War I and into the armistice and the Romanovs are eliminated in 1917, what is the population of Russia at about this time?
About 140 million?
So, Mike wants
140, 145 million.
So a very large extent of the population probably lives in the boonies, all the way out to the west, further down south. Are we really saying, therefore, that the area of contention between the white Russians and the red Russians and the counter-revolutionaries really took place within a certain geographical area, St. Petersburg to Moscow, going north.
Well, yeah, you're saying, yeah.
Of east and west, and most of the people didn't have a clue what was going on.
Well, of course not. In fact, you know, how many Americans really know what's going on in the Middle East right now?
Very few.
Okay. And so, yeah, you see that. But then again, at the same time, this goes back to Lenin. You know, I want a dictatorship of the proletariat, a hardcore group of revolutionaries. That's why I do not want a democratic approach. I want a group of hardcore revolutionaries. And that's what he's going to put together here. Him, Nikolai Bukharin, Trotsky will join the group. Stalin's involved in this in the background. A group of hardcore revolutionaries. Why do we need to have a democratic approach for? That's not what I want. And then again, go back to Marx. A dictatorship of the proletariat? Does that sound like democracy? That's what he calls democracy, but it really isn't democracy? No, of course not. And so, you know, we're not going to wind up with a democratic state, but that shouldn't be a surprise here. Look what he did in January 1918. Put the troops in, took all the delegates out. Dictatorship of the proletariat. Yeah, now there's a problem with that because all power to the all power to the workers. Well, if the workers are grabbing their factories just like the peasants are grabbing the land, how are you supposed to control them all? War does that. So the Civil War is actually, in the long run, a blessing for the Bolsheviks, because now we can organize everything for war. So what's the difference between what Lenin is doing and then the German military dictatorship in 1916? What America's going to do in 1917 with Bernard Baruch and the War Industries Board? Centralize control of your economy. That's what Lenin's going to do. And it's going to work in the long run. Sure, there's going to be some bumps and bounces along the way. Centralized control. And if there's anything Russians are used to, it's centralized control. They've lived with it since, what, 880 AD with Kiev and Rus. And so you are seeing here Lenin, they might not be very good in putting together a working economy, but they are good at putting together a Red Army. Now, some Bolsheviks are going to be turned off to the approach. How about using Czarist Russian officers? Czarist officers. And they are going to bring in a number of Czarist officers. One of them will be Alexei Brusilov. You know, some of these Tsarist officers are going to go with the whites. They have an agenda. Some will go with the reds, like Brusilov. However, what do Lenin and Trotsky do? Interesting. Okay, we don't quite trust these former Tsarist officers, even though they're going to be in command of Red Army formations here. So what are they going to do? Put Bolshevik commissars in every Red Army unit. And every time a former Tsarist officer will issue an order, how is it countersigned? By the political commissar. You know, and again, fast forward a few years, the Battle of Stalingrad. Who was the commander there? Vasily Chuikov. A no-nonsense, talented commander. He will be involved. He will also be involved in we'll call it the liberation of Berlin in '45. You know, when in October, going into November 1942, when Mr. Chuikov is in his bunker or in his tunnel, up with his back to the Volga, there's no place to go here because the Nazis already have 90% of Stalingrad. There's no place to go. And who is the commissar? Nikita Khrushchev, who tells Chuikov, again, Chuikov can issue an order, but guess what? You know, so Mr. Khrushchev tells Chuikov, he says, I hope you understand what's going to happen to the two of us if your defense fails. They'll have to answer to Stalin. I think you know what that means. You know, and Chuikov, yeah, I don't need any reminders here. And Chuikov is going to win. He'll hold out, he'll win. So, but the same sort of thing is going on here in 1918, 1919. The army is made up mostly of peasants. Mostly peasants who are fighting for what? The land more than being Bolsheviks. Workers. You know, there are actually formations of workers coming out of factories as formations in the Red Army. This happened again in World War II, where some of these workers who were in their factory, working in factories, Leningrad is an example of mine. You know, at one point when the Nazis had it surrounded, a KV-1 factory, which was a heavy tank factory, some of the workers would even drive the tanks right off the assembly line, unpainted, 4 miles to the front themselves. Yeah. And they formed worker battalions. Same sort of things happening here during the Revolution or the Civil War. So it's interesting here how what happened in the Civil War is going to be transposed in certain respects to 1941 and beyond. But again, this idea of Lenin organizing the Red Army, this is really a Bolshevik bureaucracy in action. And it works. And who's going to be in charge of this? Leon Trotsky. Trotsky will be in charge of this. He's named by Lenin to take control of the Red Army. Now, Trotsky never had military experience. Didn't have military experience, but he knows one thing: organization. Organization. But what helps him here is Moscow. Centralized control, and they branch out. Whereas the whites, like Admiral Kolchak's near Siberia, Denich is down in southern Ukraine. The whites are spread out. The Bolsheviks, centrally located. The British, the French, the Americans, you know, there's a problem for their governments. You know, they've been in the, well, especially the British and the French, they've been in the trenches for 4 years. The people want their boys home. They've had enough of this. They've had enough of this. And so by 1921, Allied troops would be pulled out. One less impediment for the Bolsheviks. Of course, you have to ask the question, well, why are they there in the first place? Mr. Churchill, let's strangle this baby in the womb. Bolshevism. Let's strangle it in the womb. One problem. The families of these troops don't want their troops there anymore. Been in the trenches for 4 years. Let's bring the boys home. The heck of what's going on in Russia. Care about that? And you can understand the family's plight. They want their boys home. Had enough of this. And Americans, what am I going to Russia for? And I don't think Woodrow Wilson was as excited about this as people like Churchill. Wilson was not a balance of power man from Europe. Mr. Churchill was. Steeped in European history. Steeped in European history. He understood what this meant, which is another reason why the French wanted the erection of a Poland, Austria, a Hungary, a Czechoslovakia, a Yugoslavia, as a buffer to what's going to be known as Bolshevik Russia or the Soviet Union. Yet at the same time here, as the Poles invade, this is fascinating. They're going to almost get to Kiev until the Red Army throws them back. One of the rising stars here for the Bolsheviks is a Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Fascinating character, very, very intelligent. He's not only a leader of men, he's a theorist. He will grasp onto the tank later on. You know, this idea of, you know, oil and gasoline is going to change everything here, folks. We're no longer using the horse and wagon to move troops. The truck. Makes sense, the truck. But then there's the tank. Unfortunately, Mr. Tukhachevsky will be caught up in the purges, and Stalin will have him shot in 1937. Tragic loss for the... And he was a marshal in his early 40s. A marshal. Doesn't get any higher than that. And so they will push the Poles back into what's going to be Poland. Now, what's interesting here is the historical phobia. Here we go again. You know, the Poles and Russians, like oil and water here. But some of the Bolsheviks are thinking, we are not getting into Poland as Russians. We are getting into Poland as a proletarian army, and the Poles should welcome us with open arms. That's not what's going to happen here. In other words, spreading this proletarian revolution through Poland into Germany, France, you know where that was going to go. Some of these people actually believe this stuff. We're not invading Poland. We're a proletarian army. Poles don't quite hold to that. And so the British and the French will send supplies to that Polish army, and they will throw the Reds back. They will throw the Reds back. But still, even though they come to an accommodation with the Poles, because both sides need a rest, the Russians are still going to lose Poland. They're still going to lose Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Finland, they're going to lose that. A lot of the Caucasus, Lenin will get back. But they lose territory, which Stalin's going to recoup anyway in 1940. Again, Mr. Stalin sees what's going on, and he's going to want that territory back. Give you an idea of why Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia are uneasy today. They live with this every day. So, we don't, they do. But this idea of war communism, of, yes, organizing the economy for war. That's what Lenin is doing with this thing known as war communism. And that's what? Taking away the power of the workers to oversee the factories, or whatever factories are left, and organizing production for what? For war. The land. You know, there are attempts here to nationalize the land. Many peasants will resist this. But that day is really coming when Stalin takes over in 1927, when he begins to collectivize the land. But organizing the economy for war, war communism. It turns off some people, but many of these peasants understand that I have to throw my lot with the Bolsheviks because I know if I go with the whites, I'll never get the land. This also leads to much fighting between the whites and the reds and executions. People who are considered, at least especially by the reds, counter-revolutionaries. And many are shot. Thousands are shot. Thousands will be shot. You know, Russia is loaded with pits. During the First World War, and now the Russian Revolution, Civil War, and what's going to happen in World War II? I mean, the Einsatzgruppen alone, in the summer of 41, well into 42, will exterminate a million, upwards, some of these historians say upwards of 1.5 million people of the Jewish faith. Yeah, this is before Auschwitz. Some of the gypsies, political commissars, Hitler ordered, they all have to be shot. Capture them, shoot them. He wants to purge the Russian army of that political affiliation to the Soviet party. And so in 1919, 1920, the Bolsheviks are able to, they're going to win this civil war. The problem here is the economy is in the tank. And so he's going to have to enact this idea of a dictatorship. Now, I find this fascinating, that the thousands of people who died, and again, this leads to a situation you saw when the Russians went into Afghanistan. Orphans? Doesn't when a lot of families are killed in a war, doesn't that leave orphans? There were groups in many places of the country, groups of parentless children just wandering around. And so they're going to get into state-sponsored orphanages. And and some of the Bolsheviks thought this was manna from heaven. Here are young kids, and we can mold their minds to the socialist agenda. Interesting concept, isn't it? The state will take care of these children and then mold them for the future. What do you think you saw in Afghanistan, you know, when you had 1.3 million Muslim dead? Where do you think some of these children who were 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 years old in those refugee camps from Afghanistan and the Pakistan, where do you think some of them wound up?
In the military.
In the madrasas?
Yeah.
Yes. The madrasas, you know, at one point, there were 8,000 registered madrasas in Pakistan and some 25,000 unregistered. 30 to 35,000 of these things. And how do you think some of these boys, forget the girls, the boys, how do you think some of these kids are going to come out when they're done, when they're 14, 16, 18, 20? Future jihadis? Yes. Well, what do you think the Reds are thinking here back in 19, 20, 21, 22, 23? Wow. One's secular, one's religious. What's the difference? I don't really see one. Basic premise is the same. What do you think Mussolini was doing here? Inculcating the young in the fascist agenda? I mean, there's a lady who always goes to my talks at the Weston Senior Center. She's a nice lady. She's pushing 90 now. And she was in that League of German Maidens in the 30s. And she showed me a photograph of her. She was a beautiful girl, blonde hair, blue eyes. And she was in that uniform of the League of German Maidens. She was telling me in her broken English what it was like to be in the League of German Maidens. She always goes to my talks there. And fascinating lady. And her son comes with her to my talks. And she's about 90 now. She gets around pretty well. Boy, has she got stories to tell. Interesting when you listen to somebody like that. Wow. Well, this is the same sort of thing the Reds were going to do. Another problem. Again, you're going to see, though, all power to the Soviets. And keep in mind, this dictatorship of the proletariat, because of the war, a lot of these individual Soviets, which keep in mind, go back to the beginning of this revolution, when you had these Soviets, workers, soldiers, and peasants rising up spontaneously in St. Petersburg and in the outlying districts. All pushing out, Tsar, I almost said crown appointed from the American Revolution here, Tsarist appointed administrators and exacting political control in their localities. All power to the Soviets. Again, you saw the same sort of thing happen here. 1773, 1774, 1775, as the British pull their troops out of the countryside and stick them in the few cities we have, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston. And so the countryside is devoid of British troops. And yet, how are the colonial administrators supposed to keep the colonists in line when the colonists are pushing them out and they have these revolutionary correspondence groups and then committees of safety? Spontaneous. It's the same sort of thing. Now, by 1920, 21, when the Russian Civil War is over with, now there's some sort of centralized control that Lenin has. The war did this. And so now they've organized this, and now you have this fledgling Soviet state coming out of the Civil War. Not many people died during the actual taking of power. It's the after effects, the Civil War. And so you saw the war bring centralized control. Well, what do you think happened here in our revolution? You had the spontaneous revolution. The founders aren't stupid. They know if they don't take control of this, someone else is. And so the Declaration of Independence here, when you get representatives from 13 colonies, 56 of them signing this document, now you're exacting centralized control over an uprising. And what are we going to do here? The Continental Army? What's Lenin doing? The Red Army. It's fascinating. Committees of safety, Soviets. Not much in the way of difference here. Politically, yes, I'll give you that. How we're going to wind up as opposed to how the Reds take Russia through. But it's interesting what you see here. And so this idea, again, this idea of the Bolsheviks organizing a government, go back to the Red Army. That's what they did best in 1918, 19, 19, 20, and 21. Organizing the Red Army. Interesting what Lenin says here. This comes out of Owen Giap's book, People's War, People's Army. His insurrection manual from the Vietnam War. which is an interesting book, by the way. Lenin says, and this is what he says about revolution, and he calls the oppressed class. Interesting what he says here. An oppressed class, if not making efforts to learn to wield arms and to obtain them, only deserve to be treated as slaves. An oppressed class, if not making efforts to learn to wield arms and to obtain them, only deserves to be slaves. But there has to be some organization to this. You can't just let a spontaneous group rise up. What is it Mao once said? Political power comes from the barrel of a gun. It's one of the most accurate statements ever to come out of the 20th century, for crying out loud. And yet, you know, when you talk about revolutionaries like Lenin, like Mao, I always, you know, a more refined outlook on this is Thomas Jefferson, who, with his marvelous command of the English language, bouncing off what Lenin says and what Mao later says before them. Thomas Jefferson, the tree of liberty is watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Wow. Wow. Is it along the same lines of Lenin and Mao? Yeah, it sure is. Revolution. Interesting what you see here. You know, when you compare what you saw in our revolution and then what you saw in the Russian Revolution. And it's kind of distressing that we don't make these comparisons. You know, and when you take a look at our guerrilla movement, I like to call our guerrillas partisan patriots. Like the guerrilla movement down south, 1777, 78, down to 1780. You know, Thomas Sumpter, Francis Marion, remember him, the swamp fox? And how, yeah, they would pick and pick and pick and pick and pick, and then they'd run back into the swamps. It drove the British Army nuts. But then again, they had the people on their side because they didn't oppress the people.